right, Shabbat Shalom. Before I get started, as has been mentioned, I'm a coffee snob by personal passion, so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the generosity of the Ladle Fund for bringing Barista Dave here on Sunday mornings while I wait for my kids during Hebrew school. To its credit, it's gotten me to join Morning Minyan on those Sundays as well. I picked the Shabbat to speak on my 2024 sabbatical, spent researching marketplace inequity in the coffee industry as a Fulbright scholar in Columbia. This week's Parsha Re'eh infamously reaffirms both the Shemitah as the sabbatical year for rejuvenation, as well as the deep values of fairness, such as Yovel, the Jubilee, and Tzedakah that drive our Jewish tradition as individuals in a society. However, I realized this year's triennial cycle actually omitted those verses. So, thrown for a loop. As it turns out, though, the text we did read touched on something even deeper that directly aligns with my research, the structural design of fairness and its intertwined problem with distance, which also aligns with my experiences with fairness and distance as a Jew. So, my apologies in advance as I get a little bit professorial here this morning. In Parshat Re'eh, Moshe repeats the laws of the Torah for the Israelites, adapting our tradition from wandering in the wilderness to settling in a new land. Up until this point, the Israelites could offer sacrifices wherever they wanted, but in Re'eh, the Torah repeatedly demands that they centralize all major worship and economic tithing in the emergent Eretz Yisrael, the place that the eternal your God will choose. As a researcher, I read that and saw an immediate equity problem. Once you centralize power and wealth at a core, structural design naturally stops being fair to its periphery. Moshe recognizes this. He sees that the participation and contribution of the Levites scattered outside of Eretz Yisrael are fundamental to sustaining Torah, yet they have no economic security. So he introduces a massive shift to our tradition. First, he warns the Israelites about the structural potential for unfairness. Be sure not to neglect the Levite as long as you live upon your land. And then he bridges the distance. If the place where God has chosen to establish God's name is too far from you, you may slaughter any of the cattle or sheep that God has given you, as I've instructed you, and you may eat to your heart's content in your settlements. By decoupling daily survival and consumption from the core, Torah validates Jewish life in the periphery as whole, vibrant, and self-sustaining. Similarly, in the Haftarah, Yeshayahu promises the Jewish exiles in a corrupt Bavel that a fair society will eventually be rebuilt from the trauma of exile. But he also warns, by righteousness you shall be established, you shall be safe from oppression. The Hebrew word for oppression used here is oshek, which means freedom from tyranny and corruption, but it also refers to the marketplace crime of holding back wages from a worker or profit from a producer. Yeshayahu also asks a fundamental question about what we value. Why do you spend money for what is not bread, and your earnings on what does not satisfy? In asking this, he points out a total disconnect between what the consumer spends and what actually sustains the life of the producer. I see these concepts of justice in the Parsha and Haftarah connecting. You can't build a fair core if your basic structure relies on the exploitation of the margins. And how does the disconnect between the core and the margins happen? It happens like many things through distance. When the consumer is physically, socially, economically, sometimes even emotionally disconnected from the person producing goods, it becomes remarkably easy to ignore exploitation. Distance masks oshek. Now, show of hands, how many of you drink coffee? Most of you. Now, how many of you know that coffee is a fruit? Okay, or that it's a toasted seed of a cherry, it's brewed in water like tea. Now I'm curious, how many of you buy fair trade coffee? Organic, bird-friendly, pure? When you buy that, how does that make you help make you feel about helping the world? In January 2024, I embarked as a Fulbright scholar for a post-tenure sabbatical from UMass Lowell, where I'm an associate professor of marketing. I connected with a colleague, Professor Andres Barrios of Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, to start researching consumers' impact on coffee farmers. Data from a 2026 survey conducted by the Specialty Coffee Association shows a brutal economic reality. Coffee retailers retain double the profit, yet coffee farmers absorb double the risk. In other words, farmers consistently get the short end of the stick. Climate change raises farm production costs, geopolitical conflict raises shipping costs, but those skyrocketing coffee prices you hear about in the news or you feel in your wallet at Dunkin', coffee farmers barely see a cent of that. The reality is your buying a bag of coffee makes very little difference on the day-to-day lives for the majority of coffee farmers. For them, the $1 to $2, maybe 30 cents more if we're talking about fair trade, that a farmer makes from your bag of coffee nearly breaks even on the $2 to $3 it costs them to produce it. And yet, in practice, marketers continue to lead consumers to believe that your choice can make a difference. After 4 months traveling to coffee farms around Colombia and interviewing different stakeholders in the industry there, I don't know that that's reality. Andres and I call our theory moral market entrapment, and let's, I guess, in the weeds about it here. It describes how the moral responsibility of our individual consumer choices paradoxically entraps coffee producers in an inequitable status quo. We, as individuals, buy ethical coffees to feel good about our contribution to society, but the structure centralizes power at the consumer's retail core while keeping producers invisible at the periphery. The more fragmented our ethical choices, the more challenges farmers face just to keep up. Frankly, this theory applies not just to coffee, but to many of the goods and services that we spend our money on. Since I returned, I've been asked by roasters, cafe owners, and coffee drinkers what they should do differently, because everyone wants to do good. This is a difficult question for me to answer, because the industry's structural complexity doesn't easily allow anyone just to cut out the middlemen to bridge the distance and eliminate OSHEC. My time in Colombia wasn't all research work, though. It was also a navigation of personal distance. My family came down to visit for a week. We got to do some sightseeing together. I got COVID for the first time after diligently avoiding it for 4 years. Andres took me with his family to a salt cathedral under a mountain outside of the city. I thought I was going to die in a plane crash once. I got kicked out of my long-term Airbnb because I couldn't explain to the doorman in Spanish that I wasn't a drug runner. I experienced municipal water cutoffs due to drought, and folks around here think that odd even watering is an inconvenience. I saw sunset vistas over coffee mountains as though I was looking across Eretz Israel, but for coffee. There was no shortage of emotionally resonant moments there. But before I tie all of this together, I'd like to share 2 unique Jewish experiences I had there that I still get emotional talking about. My time in Colombia overlapped with both Purim and Pesach. Bogota has about 4,500 Jews in a capital city of 10 million. I reached out via Instagram to a local Masorti community, Asociación Israelita Montefiore, to see if I could attend their Megillah reading. Given Colombia's well-documented history of violence, plus heightened security following October 7th, which was only 4 months earlier, security was tight, but they put me on the list. I arrived for Purim alone, barely speaking Spanish, knowing no one. As Havdalah began, they lit the candle and started singing. Tears came to my eyes. Even though my family wasn't with me, I felt that they were doing the same things at the same time. They were here in Amuna, doing the same tefillah, the same melodies as I was down there, 2,600 miles away, at the periphery and at the core. The distance was gone. Instead of a Megillah reading, they performed a full Purim spiel with costumes and musical accompaniment, all in Spanish. Downstairs in their social hall, there was a carnival with bouncy houses, face painting, lollipop trees, and even the table of tchotchke prizes, just like the carnival here at Amuna, and just like my shul when I was younger. And my fear about not getting any hamantash in that Purim, well, there were trays of chocolate chip and prune and poppy seed for everyone. Again, tears to my eyes. I could barely communicate with these folks, except for being Jewish. A month later, this was about 8 days left in my stay in Colombia, came Pesach, and I joined with about 150 members for their Seder. I opened my Haggadah de Pesach, Ma neshana halayla hazeh, porque esta noche es diferente de todas las otras noches. You all understood that, right? We had our matzo ball soup together, sang birkat together, and oh, say shalom b'mermav, hoo-yah. My eyes watered again, and I wish I could share my audio recording of that. My family was home here having the same meal, recounting Los Cuatro Tios, searching for the same afikomen. The Seder in Bogota wasn't at the periphery of Jewish life. It was vibrant, whole, and self-contained in our common ground. In packing up my second Airbnb that week, I felt as though I was an Israelite, for I could not tarry on my exodus home back to my family. I learned a lot about, over those 4 months, about the coffee industry and its failure to value producers fairly alongside consumers, about myself and my ability to survive in a place with a different culture, different history, and language, and about being Jewish in a diaspora fracturing over who is good and who is bad. Emperor Charlemagne once said, "Avoir une autre langue, c'est posséder une deuxième âme." To have another language is to possess a second soul. Over the years, both studying French in Montreal and then choppily picking up Spanish in Colombia, having multiple languages has flattened the distance for me between multiple souls. Our tradition gives us a nuanced vocabulary. Am Yisrael, our spiritual peoplehood. Kol Yisrael, the collective of Jews everywhere. Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel that God chose in Re'eh. And Medinat Yisrael, the modern political state. They're not interchangeable, yet in everyday Jewish discourse, we often flatten them into a single concept, losing the vital distinctions our tradition gave us. Regardless of our realities, our kahilot, our communities, are what sustain us. The radical core of Jewish identity in Re'eh is that Jewish life, justice, and community are vibrant, whole, and fully realized wherever we stand. Our covenant is one of here-ness, and the periphery is also a core. And that brings us back to the name of this week's Parsha, Re'eh, the imperative to see or to behold. When distance grows, whether it's physical, economic, political, or emotional, it becomes easy to place ourselves at the center of a moral map while pushing others into an abstract periphery. In marketing, that leads us to accept a paternalistic kind of fairness, where consumers feel good given a few extra cents to a coffee farmer as long as the core retains total control. In geography, it leads us to view other vibrant diaspora communities, like Bogota, as forgotten margins, rather than living centers of Jewish life. And in our politics, distance leads us to shrink our moral maps in subtle ways that create blind spots in our ability to see others' humanity. When distance is multiplied by deep collective trauma, fear, and anxiety, raw feelings for all of us in this age of anti-Semitism, and grief for Israel, expanding that moral map can feel terrifying. It can feel like an existential risk to our own Jewish survival to hold the pain of other groups alongside our own. Parsha Re'eh, however, demands us that we actually see. It reminds us that humanity is not a zero-sum game where winners necessitate losers. Safety, freedom, joy, equality, dignity cannot be privileged for a core group while forsaken on the periphery for others. When Moshe allowed Israelites to build community in their own settlements, he decoupled everyday human flourishing from a single dominant core. Validating our own flourishing humanity and standing for the safety and survival of Am Yisrael does not require us to deny or diminish that same humanity and flourishing for other groups. Recognizing their here-ness on their own terms does not weaken our Jewish survival. Rather, closing the distance fulfills the highest demand of Torah, that each human being is created in B'Tselem Elohim, in the divine image. True holiness is refusing to relegate human beings to an invisible periphery, whether they're coffee farmers in Colombia, other groups that are yearning for dignity, or neighbors sitting here inside our own sanctuary. Whether we are striving to be ethical consumers or living out our Jewish values, I urge all of us to look past the distance, stand firm against Oshek, and center our common humanity first. Shabbat Shalom.